In the previous segment, we saw that the Palestinian Arab population was held in refugee camps in poor conditions and were never provided full citizenship and in many cases even full rights. In 1950, the number of Palestinian Arab refugees was listed at over 500,000. By the 1980s, it was nearly 2 million. And by 2018, the number had risen to 5.5 million Palestinian Arab refugees. This number is staggering and still growing. The reason why, we'll get to in a moment. Today, there are about 70 or so refugee camps holding 30% of the Palestinian Arab population. Others live in their host countries with various levels of citizenship and rights. Some of you listeners may be a little bit surprised to hear how many of these Palestinian Arab refugee camps exist in the modern state of Israel today. The answer is none. Many people hear about the Palestinian refugee camps and instantly assume that these terrible places are to blame on the state of Israel, that the state of Israel is responsible for the poor treatment and conditions of Palestinian Arabs in refugee camps. But why? Why isn't the state of Jordan being blamed for the treatment of Palestinian refugees in their 13 Palestinian refugee camps? Why hasn't Jordan offered the 2.2 million refugees in their camps the right to join the already 1.8 million Palestinian Jordanians who live native in the country? Why isn't Syria being blamed for the treatment of refugees in their 12 Palestinian refugee camps? Or Lebanon in their 12? How is it the fault of Israel for these countries choosing not to provide asylum or support to the Palestinian people in their borders? Why have they chosen not to provide full citizenship or full rights to these Palestinian refugees? Here's a better question for you. Why do 8 refugee camps still exist in Gaza, which is under the full control of the Palestinian group Hamas? Should these Palestinians not just be living in the rest of Gaza with the other Palestinians? On that same note, why are those refugee camps in the West Bank that are under the control of the Palestinian Authority still in use? Why have these people not been, quote, resettled to the Palestinian territories and removed from the world's refugee numbers? This would explain why the number of Palestinian refugees is not decreasing. But how are these numbers of the Palestinian Arab refugees growing year after year? There are 2 reasons for this. Firstly, it seems that these Arab countries, including the Palestinian leadership themselves, want to keep their own people in terrible conditions rather than provide them with the freedom that they deserve. This ensures that the number of refugees does not drop, since these people are not being resettled or moved out of the camps into other areas of the country. Secondly, the United Nations ensures that under the UN Refugee Organization that Palestinians alone keep their refugee status in perpetuity. This is unheard of in any other place across the world. As an example, those Syrian refugees that fled the recent civil war and found refuge in North America are now citizens of the countries that accepted them. They and their children are no longer refugees. This is not the case for the Palestinian Arabs. Palestinian Arabs who fled the conflict in 1948 and 1967 went to various Arab states for safety. 30 years later, they are still kept in refugee camps, and the UN recognizes them and their offspring as forever refugees. The United Nations Relief and Work Agency for the Palestinian Refugees, a group responsible for only Palestinian refugees, has a budget of $1.6 billion. Compare this to the $1 billion that is provided by the UN to all other refugees around the world. Nearly half of what the Palestinian refugees are given for support. Let's consider the numbers on this issue. The UN reports that there are approximately 27 million refugees around the world today, not including the Palestinian Arabs. Palestinian Arabs make up about 7 million refugees. This is approximately 20% of the world's refugee population. Consider that 20% of the world's refugee population gets nearly twice as much money as the rest of the 80% of refugees. I'm not sure if this is just cynical or realistic, but the fact that the Palestinian people are being supplied with billions of dollars a year from the international community in order to support their people being held in refugee camps at their own hands. I can understand why the Gazan and West Bank leadership wants to maintain the refugee system that allows them to remove the costs of feeding and healthcare for these people from their own budgets. What we can clearly see here is a system that is in place that maintains the refugee crisis by Arab nations, and even the Palestinians themselves, to ensure the Palestinian cause will never improve. Unfortunately, thanks to great public relations systems that are in place with social media and uneducated celebrities, somehow the reality of these camps, who controls them, and what country they're in, has completely been turned upside down. In the end, the fact that the Palestinian Arabs are being kept within a refugee camp system is tragic. We see that the Palestinian Arabs were not the only refugees created in the conflict in 1948, and that there was a major difference between the Jewish refugees and the Arab ones. One side, Israel, chose to risk their own economic survival and take their refugees out of their temporary camps provide them with social support, and make them citizens. We can see that Israel did actually create a refugee crisis. Israel's very existence caused hundreds of thousands of Jewish Arabs to become refugees when the Arab nations retaliated against their historic Jewish populations. Israel's survival in 1948 also gave reasons for the Arab nations to keep their Palestinian Arab populations in what were supposed to be temporary camps. Israel's continued survival in 1967 gave the Arab countries reasons for those camps to become permanent. This seems like win-win for the Arab nations who get to use this as a weapon against the state of Israel, blame them for the refugee crisis while gaining billions of dollars in support. So next time you hear the term Palestinian refugee camp, hopefully you'll be able to better understand where these camps are located, who is keeping these poor groups in this cycle of perpetual poverty and refugee status, and that you and your country through the United Nations might be funding this cycle. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.